Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and with me, as always, is Ansgar Odinson.
Hey, everybody.
And we have today Dr. Misha Griffith, one of our favorites. And before we start the show,
A darling of the show, really.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Before we start, I did want to we need to cover one quick thing because there's been kind of a change in our status. We have been officially certified now by Dr. Griffin as slightly more entertaining than grading papers. So thank you
Big
for
step
that.
up.
I think, yeah, I hope I could grade papers or I could do in time. She had to think about that for about a half hour, had a cup of coffee, was like, I don't know. So, but we have the certification. Ansgar wants it to be our new tagline. I think it may be worth it, but we'll put that up. So thank you very much for that vote of confidence. I appreciate it, and welcome once again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, for
Absolutely.
the second time. Yeah, we canceled on a lot of guests. We're catching up, but so thank you for coming back. We wanted to discuss today media and how media has changed, and starting from quite some time back all the way to today, and how it influences our culture and how it has evolved differently in the U.S. than in Europe. So could you perhaps start with sort of what is media and when did media really start?
Oh, well, I could take digital Hammurabi into consideration and say clay tablets. Actually, I have I went on a tour 2 weeks ago of some sites of Native American petroglyphs in the high Nevada desert. Some of them are thought to be 10,000 years old. Petroglyphs, as in carving into rocks, of multiple generations of carvings, as far as I can tell, and a few painted glyphs, but mainly carved glyphs. And they can tell they're multiple generations and that they were of interest to later generations because these petroglyphs have scratches on them, very gentle scratches on them, made at different times. And the idea was, they think, because they are not scratches to rub out the message, but in fact scratches to add their own maybe interpretation to it, possibly the idea of connecting themselves to the magic that is in these petroglyphs that they perceived, was that they were scratching them to pick up that vibe of the prior generations. This is kind of speculative for the people who study it. I'm not an anthropologist, but you wanted to you wanted to talk about early media.
Well, I just like
wanted to go.
so spin. They already had spin back then. Somebody sitting there going like, I'm gonna put my own little spin on this.
Well, I mean, it kind of makes sense because I mean, culturally, you see around the world the idea of words or stories in written form being a form of magic.
Mhm. Yeah, the ability. Well, when you think about it, you've got the Mesopotamian priests who are doing astronomical observations. How much power does it give a priest when they can say the moon is going to rise 2 days from now and it's only going to be a half moon? And then it does, and everyone says, wow, he can tell the future.
Well, and look at what being able to track things like the sky does for farmers.
Yes, you
That's
cannot
huge
you
power.
you you cannot improve your agriculture unless you're keeping records. Without keeping those kind of records, you can't keep in your head what works from one year to another. With enough data, then you can improve your yield by observing what worked, what didn't, carrying out these same practices. But most of that information, if we're talking about epistemological ideas, are coming down to people. Only a handful of people were literate, so only a handful of people had access to the written words, but you had plenty of wives' tales, folk tales. I know of one particular group in Northern California that was insistent you do not plant anything in this field until the snow disappeared from this particular peak. And once the snow is gone, it's safe to plant. So it's that kind of epistemological idea of putting information forward, and I think that's the basis of media.
And this is
Getting people.
why I love having Misha on. Wait, this is a completely aside from what we had ever planned on talking about, but it is 100% fascinating, nonetheless.
Well, thank you very much. I just this was popping into my head as you're asking a question. So I admit this thing up here, it's kind of like a hoarder's attic. You don't know what's up here. Uh, I don't either.
Right. But I
Stuff
guess
just
what
kind
we're
of falls
really
out.
talking about today is more mass media,
Sure.
media
Sure.
that has more, you know,
Mhm.
broad reach.
Well, you uh, with writing, with paper, especially with printing, then all of a sudden, books, pronouncements, pamphlets become uh, become almost currency, become useful in a way that a book was not useful to your average medieval peasant.
Right.
Books were rare, they were locked up in monasteries, or there was one copy at the university that was used by the lecturer, and everyone else learned everything by rote. And so when books become more plentiful, that's when you see a real change in epistemology in
Right.
that people didn't know good books from bad.
Well, I mean,
There was
before you
no,
had one expert who could transcribe this book, and so the skills to create a book were incredibly rare. And then you get something like the press, and all of a sudden, you know what I mean, that one person's work turns into hundreds of books, thousands of books.
with very little as far as copyright laws.
Hmm.
So you had lots of printers all over Europe who would just grab other people's works, typeset them in their own set, print them out, and
Oh,
the author would
really?
never see a dime from
I
any
Would
of
they
this
would they
work.
actually put their own name on it?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
There is a case, Albrecht Dürer, the German Renaissance painter
Mhm.
and engraver, the guy who gave us, oh boy, you would know his work, but he had a very distinctive um, initials that he put on all of his work. He was one of the first people to start using engraving and printing and selling very cheap copies of his work. But he had very distinctive initials, AD. And he found out that there was a group of Italian painters who were painting works in Italy and signing his initials to their works.
Oh
And
my
he had to
god.
travel to Italy to sue them.
Wait, was it well?
So,
So he was actually getting credit for works he didn't do.
exactly. But he
Oh
wasn't
wow.
getting paid. So definitely these ideas of who owned the intellectual property, how technologically these things got out, these are all in the mix of how to understand media.
So
Um,
Napster is nothing new. Legal fight is nothing new. It's just it's just the
yeah,
digital version.
it's just the digital version. We're not doing that much new. We're just doing it faster
Right.
and in more colors.
So now you were, I think, going to say that
Sure.
one problem was you couldn't tell whether something was authoritative or not. You couldn't tell between the good and the bad and what was. So could you talk a bit more about that? About
Sure. With medieval scholasticism, that need that we see in people like Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas to marry Christian theology with classical philosophy, because that's how they learned Latin. They read Cicero, they read Livy, they read Tacitus, they read all the great Roman authors, and some Greek, a few handful of Greek, Aristotle. But these guys are pagan. So, how do you marry the two? Scholasticism was a way for the intellectuals and the churches to say, this is how you interpret it. This is the orthodox. Anything beyond that is unorthodox. So, the authority of the text became really the hallmark. And you accepted the text because of who said it,
Hmm.
not because of what it said. And so with William of Ockham and with the Protestant Reformation, you see a break from that. When Martin Luther talks about every man a priest and that every person should interpret scripture their own way, then you're breaking the authority and people are interpreting things their own way. And that makes a big break. That's when we get into eventually a couple of bumps like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, etc., and witch burnings. You get into the Age of Enlightenment, where you're seeing a break from the authority of text to the scientific revolution and the ideas of people in the British Royal Society uh, for sciences. And I can't remember the Latin motto of the British Royal Society of Sciences, but it was on no one's authority in Latin. Basically, don't take anyone's word on authority. And so this individual, independent interpretation of language, of reading, of what's working, this becomes the forefront of the movement of the Age of Enlightenment. Before this period, you had gatekeepers who were preventing a lot of printing happening, and that was the governments. You had the governments putting licenses on printers, and you had the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and its index of banned books. So you had these certain gatekeepers that were trying very hard to keep people from printing. But in, when was it? Oh, 1695, the House of Commons ends the licensing of printers in Great Britain. And it is absolutely no question that that leads to the first daily newspapers in London in 1701, 1704, I believe, was that when you see printers able to print without having to pay fees to the government, that opens them up to creating newspapers. And newspapers are really the first time we see information put all into one place and printed and distributed to the many. You can define your technology by how many go into the creation of the object and how many use the object. So newspapers have a small amount of writers, correspondents. Correspondents for early newspapers were people who wrote the newspaper's letters. That was just letters being sent in saying,
The
hey,
editorial section.
no, not even that. No, it
Well, no,
was,
it wasn't. They didn't give it an edit, but it's essentially just an editorial I mean, it's just that people just drop in a line and say this is what's going on, and that's
well,
the
yeah,
that's the
your foreign correspondent was someone who said, I just took a trip to Egypt. This is what I saw, and
yeah.
writes the letter and sends it to the Times or whatever newspaper, and they print it without questioning it. So gatekeepers for the early newspapers were the publishers who had enough money to do this. And of course, newspapers cannot survive with just people spending farthings or pennies or dimes or nickels to buy the actual physical copy. The physical copy and the work that goes into it is much, much more, costs much, much more. And that's where classified advertising comes in. Selling the room for advertising is what keeps these newspapers going. And oftentimes the advertising, those classified ads were on the front page. That's really fun to read these earlier newspapers, is that the front page is classified. You would think that the headlines are. No,
Really?
it's the classified ads.
Yeah, that's so
So let me
alien.
real quick. So we had just one or a couple of comments that I guess the host mic is a little higher than everybody else's, and so Misha and I aren't coming out as loud. So we had a couple of
Oh,
complaints.
okay.
I don't know if we can get that. No, I don't think that's you, Misha. I think maybe
Okay.
I think there just needs to be an adjustment on the OBS there.
Okay.
And then I had a question. What was the unless so the question I wanted to ask, but if Ansgar's got a question, I was
No, I was gonna
how did
say it looks like
how
one person. I was just gonna say it looks like one person had the complaint. I did make an adjustment just in case, but other people are saying that they're not having the same problem.
Oh, okay, then I misread it.
So,
What was I going to say? Okay, so it's so how much control was the advertisers starting to have over the content, and who else had control over this content, and how was that? How did that start to influence how news and media came out?
I'm not sure. I don't know how much the advertisers had, or the people who were advertising in the newspapers, there weren't marketing firms or advertisers. It was just individuals or companies doing it. But you can probably assume that the newspaper, the publisher, is wanting to get as many ads as possible. But, pardon me, one thing that these having classified ads does to newspapers, for the character of the newspaper, is it makes it very regional.
mhm.
If I'm living in Boston, I'm not going to buy advertising in a North Carolina newspaper.
Right.
So the regionality of newspapers is such that in America, that's an important frame to look at them into. In London, it's very different. In London, the newspapers are are really the collection of information for investors. London being a shipping, an imperialistic leadership, and where all of the information is going, and of course their investment in science, etc. London newspapers are looking more towards the financial reader and putting information in that. And that becomes very important when it gets to the invention of the telegraph. The invention of the telegraph, we like to think of it as, oh, that's how you get news of a family member dying back in the 1950s. Actually, the telegraph was a financial tool. The telegraph let everybody know which ship was landing where and what they had in it. And that was crucial information for every investor, because the investment community was often more interested in shipping and getting product from point A to point B than almost anything else. So that's what the telegraph facilitated. It's not until the Crimean War that we see the telegraph being used for things like war news. And the
I'm
Crimean
curious.
War,
By this time, are we already seeing a divergence in media between, like across the ocean?
yeah, yeah. Reading American newspapers feels much more insular,
Hmm.
much more of the little regional newspapers and what's happening there, as opposed to um, London. The London newspapers are talking about what's happening all over the world, but mainly with an eye on uh, industry and colonialism and shipping.
Gotcha. So
Y-
if I pick up an American newspaper, it's going to be, oh look, old Jeb got sick, and we just got a new sheriff. I pick up the London newspaper, they're going to be talking about the price of iron in India.
My favorite is the I forgot what newspaper it was. It was around 1820. Had an interesting um, classified ad on the front.
Hmm.
Wanted a cook, will pay top dollar. FS Key. Contact FS Key.
FS.
You
FS
have to
key.
FS Key. Francis Scott Key, the
Oh,
author of the Star Spangled Banner, was looking for a cook, top dollar paid.
Interesting.
That's not a wage.
No, that's just claiming I'm going to pay you really, really well without actually saying, oh,
That's
they're wanting to buy a cook, like a
yeah.
slave.
exactly.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, Mr. Home Land of the
Home of the,
Free
yeah.
and
He's
Home of the
looking.
Brave.
He's
Yeah,
looking to
we
buy a cook, not
Okay,
to hire
this is a
one.
later
Yeah.
classified, but one of my favorites old ones is actually it's for the Tommy gun, and it's an advertisement, and it says they call it the anti-bandit gun, and they're talking about it's the safest gun to fire in city streets.
Whoa.
Seriously. This
Whoa.
advertisement is actually telling you how safe it is to fire a fully automatic weapon in city streets.
Jeez.
But I love that it's still the same. It's still the same kind of argument that we're having now, and still the same kind of framing of it, which is like, well, the only thing that's going to stop a bad guy with a gun is a
Is
good guy with a gun, and you
it's
want
a Tommy
our
gun.
Tommy gun. That's what you want. If there's a bandit, this is what you're going to
No,
use.
but
Well,
the
it was a advertisement to try and sell directly to the police. They were trying to put the Tommy guns in the hands of the
Oh wow.
police.
oh my gosh.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Well, there's considerable there's a need to understand how to read these old classified ads in these old newspapers. Uh, just a couple of months before she died, Cokie Roberts, who I adored, put out a book or put out an article talking about abortion and claiming that abortion did not happen in the 19th century because she looked through 19th century newspapers and didn't find anything about it.
Oh, wow.
And the Twitterverse, the historians on the Twitterverse absolutely went crazy, especially Clio Nursing, which is a group of historians of the nursing industry and the practice. And they basically said, you won't find the word abortion. They did not use that word in the 19th century. But then they went on and listed all of these classified ads and products that were in daily newspapers advertised for women's complaints and all sorts of different code words that they used for abortion. And they were abortifacients that were readily available over the counter.
Well, and it's still very much the same today. I mean, if you're trying to, pick up a hooker off the newspaper, what you'll usually find. I'm sorry, I've said too much. What were you saying?
The scope of your knowledge, Nick.
I know it's all useful. It's all useful. I don't know how I know that. I'm not. That just happened to. So, I did want to get into one thing which we had talked about briefly. This is a pet peeve of mine. It's funny because we missed Columbus Day. I wanted to, broadcast on Columbus Day and cover that because Christopher Columbus has been a pet peeve of mine for a very long time, really since high school, and since I first
Nick,
learned.
Get over
Yes.
it. He's dead.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's history. It doesn't matter anymore. Well, Christopher Columbus was a genocidal maniac, and even some of his stronger apologists will say that he was a genocidal maniac. But hey,
the
he
first,
discovered.
first entry in his journal after meeting, indigenous people. These people will make perfect slaves.
Yes, it was that. He laughed at them when they cut their fingers off because they held the sword by the wrong end and didn't know. He wrote about how he would test the sharpness of their swords by taking their flesh from their side and cutting it off to see if he'd cut their hands if they weren't producing. He was not a very nice guy. And in fact, people would commit suicide rather than let themselves be captured by him. It was a terrible, but there was a book written, oh Jesus, I've forgotten who wrote it. The Life and Times of Christopher Columbus by, I want to say, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Nathaniel, that was, yep, you're right. Life and Times of Christopher Columbus was
Yep.
Hawthorne. And
Nathaniel Hawthorne frames our modern understanding of Columbus until we get real scholarly historians getting into his works. Hawthorne was really off the mark with his understanding of Columbus because he had some access to some of Columbus's letters. He really was doing research in primary sources, but he was being constrained by certain people who didn't want him to see other things. So he was making a lot of stuff up about Columbus.
Well, he did. So he invented a tremendous amount of stuff, but there was no way. So this book comes out, and nobody can. I mean, it's Hawthorne, so everybody just buys everything he says, despite the fact there's just huge amounts of misinformation in there, and that still shapes my daughters. So my daughters know all about what really happened with Columbus, and so they are in school. They're still learning that he discovered America, which wasn't true. He didn't even set foot on America until his third voyage, where we were already mapped by Amerigo Vespucci. That's why we're called America and not Columbia. At any rate, so my daughters will go correct this, but they're still, and that most of their teachers say, yeah, we know, but we have to teach the curriculum as it is, and that curriculum is shaped entirely by this book that came out 150, 200 years ago, and we still, and even the modern media can't overturn the message that this book has because we were founded on it.
all throughout the early
Very good.
1900s too, you see a lot of people kind of attempting to stamp the Colombian name across America, you know.
Yeah, it was a big deal. The 500th anniversary was a big deal, but that that passion died out after the 1960s. Thank you, Howard Zinn. Um,
Yes,
but I want to go back to newspapers, if I
Yes.
may,
please.
if that's okay.
Well, no, just a
Um,
short aside because I thought it dovetailed
sure.
in nicely. But
So I talked about British newspapers and I talked about American newspapers. Newspapers in France, completely different deal, because they are wrapped up in what is happening politically and economically in France, and of course, the French Revolution. Uh, and with the French Revolution, you see the formation of political parties. Political parties had already been around in England because of the House of Commons and their constitutional monarchy, but in France there had not been the political parties until the Revolution, and then oh boy, um, the Revolution goes absolutely crazy in terms of parties, newspapers, and so with the oh I got frozen on a great shot. And so with the French uh, parties, the Jacobins, the Montagnards, all of the different parties, they're all putting out newspapers to put their ideas forward. It was a way to build platforms, political platforms. This is when a sociologist by the name of Jürgen Habermas, he's writing in the 20th century, but he starts creating the idea of the public sphere. And that is uh, the public sphere is formed when you get a populace interested in running the country, and they're getting a hold of media like newspapers, which are putting out different ideas. And then the public sphere is formed when the people gather to discuss and give feedback. The public sphere is not information from above coming down.
Mhm.
It is information gathered from abroad or from around and then being discussed. Um, it is a creature of the Age of Enlightenment with the idea that every man is a logical actor, a rational actor, and every man should be able to make their own decision. I mean, it gets all wrapped up in John Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire and everybody. Um, but newspapers are a huge part of it, but not the only part.
Where are the other parts coming from?
Coffee houses.
Oh.
Coffee has just made it to Europe in the very early portion of the 18th century. And you've got to think, water was bad for everybody to drink for a very long time, ever since we
Oh
settled
yeah.
down. Because you can't keep people from peeing in the river, upriver, from the city. So what do? You make alcohol.
Yeah.
So everyone is drinking
that's a
alcohol.
good. That's
Well,
why I don't drink. That's why I don't drink water. I don't. I
In
don't.
well,
in
yeah.
I
in
won't trust it.
China, they're drinking tea because they're boiling the water. That's safe. But in Europe, they did not have that tradition. They had mead and alcohol and wine and beer, and everyone had beer or wine or alcoholic beverages from the time they got up until the time they went to bed. Consider Europe for thousands of years. Everyone's just a tiny bit tipsy at
I
all times.
think we can. I think we should go back to that tradition. I'm good with this.
I'm all for it.
I,
I'm all
I,
for it.
I've
But
been with that tradition for quite some time, and I
yeah,
have no interest in changing. But okay.
but with the advent of coffee, all of a sudden everyone's meeting in coffee shops, and instead of being everyone being a little bit tipsy, they're jagged up on caffeine, and
Praise
they're all
beans.
excited and they're talking very quickly. Praise beans,
Mhm.
and so you get a truly different process of people talking to each other. Now they're still drinking as well, alcohol as well, but there are alternatives. and it becomes the for the average person, the coffee shop was the place to be seen. For the more wealthy, you had the salon. You had wealthy women opening up their house to invited guests, and everyone went and they had a deep intellectual discussion, or they talked about art, or they invited an author to come in and read their books. So
So
that
the
was,
coffee house really hasn't changed.
I think it's gotten boring. I
Yeah,
think
I
when you
think I would
start,
assume it's lost influence, but it's still people seem to still be doing that. That's that.
but when you start pumping that awful music into it,
Yeah.
um,
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So so now, how does this inform how people get their information and who controls it, and how does that start influencing society?
that becomes the idea that newspapers are put out by political groups or churches. The Vatican will put out multiple different newspapers in various languages to put out their ideas. Once, once the franchise is extended to the common man and then eventually to women, but it's going to take very long, um, those newspapers are going to form how people think. That's how they're
Information
going to
war.
get their information. Um, and that's it until the advent of radio. But you see more and more uh, political groups, more and more um, religious groups. Christian Science Monitor, one of the great newspapers of the world, put out by the Christian Scientists. I don't know if it's still
Uh,
aligned with the church or not, but when you start thinking of very important newspapers, you start digging back into their history, and you'll find either a political party or a religious party
so it's really
at their
not all
beginning.
that different than the way like CNN and Fox News operate nowadays.
Partisan news is not a new thing. In fact, that idea of objective news,
Mm-hmm.
of the free press and objective news, is a creature of the Cold War.
Really
is is a counterbalance to the captive media of the socialist nations.
interesting.
Yeah, you're gonna have to explain that a bit more. That's a
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
sure,
fascinating
sure.
because like we are raised here in America. Like we are drip fed really this idea of journalistic integrity, and this is what journalism is supposed to be. So you can't just shatter that illusion without
yeah. I
without
know. Give me a what do you
replacing it with something.
Jesus?
Okay,
She is
let
such
me
a
dig.
downer.
I have just dug myself a deep hole. Let me see if I can dig
Well, you
out
dig
from.
yourself out. We're gonna keep putting sand on you, but let's give this a shot.
Okay, so newspapers, as I said, they could be regional in nature, but oftentimes were put out by political parties or religious organizations. Radio is completely different. So you have to look at newspapers in competition with this new technology of radio. Uh, it gets a very slow start, but by 1920s, the early 1920s, it becomes something useful. In America, the rules and regulations of radio start under the Department of Commerce, the FCC, Federal Communications. And that is under the auspices of a very unusual Secretary of Commerce, one who is pivotally important in the 1920s, Herbert Hoover.
Really?
Hoover is the one that oversees America's formation of radio, what it is, how it is. Hoover was the ultimate of the technocrat. He was a mining engineer. That's how he made his first fortune. And he was very much laissez faire, of the very old school. So that's why American radio comes from a comes from an entrepreneurial background. The government sells licenses, but they go to public organizations. They go to companies. They go to
Yeah.
corporations. They go to entertainment firms. They go to all sorts of different people. Also, America was blessed with a very large geography in that you could have you only have a certain bandwidth for what begins as AM radio. We eventually, with DeForest, get FM radio, but there's only so much bandwidth you can sell. And America is big enough that they can divide up those bandwidths so you don't have competition in these markets. If you got two stations too close to each other uh, that were both sending out signals on 1400 AM in the same market, how can you sell advertising? How can you tune in your radio? Technologically, it would be a disaster. So America is blessed with a big enough geography and with enough hills, because most radio signals can't go over hills, that they can split it up, give it to different companies, and they sold the bandwidths for next to nothing. But the government was not supposed to make money, according to Hoover. So that's the American formation of radio. In Europe, it's completely different. Radio radio signals do not respect boundaries. And so from the very beginning, they had to have engineers, electrical engineers in trying to make decisions how to divide all these up so that each country can get its own number of bandwidths and not uh, interfere with each other. So it was real fight to get all these countries with their bandwidths. This is exactly at the same moment of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, where you have Wilson and his 14 points, and they make all of these new countries. Because at the start of the war, you had the German Empire, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had the Russian Empire, and you had the Austro Hungarian Empire, and France and England. By the end of the war, you had Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Czechoslovakia. All of these empires were gone, and you had this amalgam of all of these new countries. So they had very busily drawn their border based on language. Wilson was a huge proponent in nationalism based on language. And what is radio?
Well, right.
One point of entry. So it had to concentrate on language groups. And so radio, their signals became part of the government utilities, part of the formation of all of these new nations. And so the governments had control of the radios. They very rarely went into private hands. So all of these radio stations were run by the government. One of the few exemptions from that was Radio Luxembourg, because it was such a small country. They allowed this private radio station, and Radio Luxembourg is going to really form the listening of the radio signal from the 1930s on. They're going to be a huge mover and shaker in Europe. Other than that, you've got the British Broadcasting Company, you've got Canal in France, you've got Czechoslovakia had its own Radio Vltava. You had every country might have had a couple of radio signals, but they were in the government hands. If you owned a radio, you had to buy a license for it. You went down to the post office, you paid so much, and that was what the nations used to run the radio stations.
So what you've got here then is in the US, the radio waves are considered public space. They're owned by the citizens who can just get a license to broadcast, and they're the ones who broadcast. The government does not broadcast, essential for most intensive purposes. The government doesn't own it. The government doesn't, they license it only to keep people from stepping on each other's toes. That's it. But it belongs to the people. In Europe, it belongs to the government, and the government manages those communications, and then you get the BBC, which has always been interesting to me because I watch shows on the BBC. I enjoy the BBC. The BBC is, of course, still around, but I've always noticed there's no American broadcasting company. I mean, there's no the U.S. government doesn't have its own media source or outlet per se. I mean, there's Trump's Twitter feed, but that's but short of that, there's and I'm only half joking because that's been declared as everybody here knows, that's actually been declared the official output of, oh God, at any rate. So I'm going to move to Canada. Dave's we've got to work that out. At any rate, and then what you've got, I was always interested by, the BBC. I was like, is that a private company that just says is calling themselves the British Broadcasting BBC Corporation Company, or is it? And it's the government itself. So when you watch Sherlock on the BBC, you are watching a government program.
The BBC is going to change radically in the 1970s because, number one, rock and roll, and the influence of places like stations like Radio Luxembourg and pirate radio. But you also have the death of the guy who ran BBC forever, who insisted there's no way we're ever going to put rock and roll on the BBC. The British invasion?
Yeah.
The people in Britain did not hear the British invasion from the BBC.
Oh my God.
They heard it from Radio Caroline, Radio London, that were both pirate radios, or they heard it from Radio Luxembourg, which aimed its signal at England.
Wow.
And they sold advertising. Remember, if you're a nationally owned radio station, you are not selling advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and so these pirate stations would actually they'd be on a ship, they'd be off and they would broadcast an illegal signal, but because they were, quote, in international waters, which is a tricky situation, they could broadcast rock and roll. Now, is this maybe one reason? I don't know how big the Beatles were in the UK, but it strikes me that they were bigger in the US. Did they get less play in the UK? Was it harder for them to get heard in the UK?
Eventually, by the middle and late 60s, the BBC would allow 1 hour of rock and roll on Sunday afternoons.
Probably Sundays, okay. Yeah.
And this is why they call it a nanny state.
Yeah. But Radio Luxembourg was just fine, and of course the BBC or Britain was a capitalistic country. They could buy records.
Right.
The whole idea behind radio in America is to sell records, at least the music. Now I have a whole chapter in my dissertation about the 1950s and the spread of rock and roll, because other authors have written about the spread of rock and roll throughout Europe, especially British and especially American rock and roll, and talk about records. My chapter is on radio and how radio spread rock and roll, but it is a very unusual chapter because I look at in the 1950s, you had television, which is a family organization. Television, people gathered around the television to watch it at night. So mom, dad, sister, brother, everyone was in the living room watching television, and people could only afford one television. So it was a group activity. But after World War II, 1947, the invention of the transistor. All of a sudden, instead of radios being these huge consoles, they get smaller and smaller and smaller until they're small, that could fit in your pocket and have a little white wire that went into your ear. They only had, they didn't have stereo. These transistor radios become everybody's Christmas present, every young person's Christmas present. So when you have the transistor, you have television, and you have something else going on. People are watching television during the evening. They are not listening to radio. Radio stations all over the United States are panicking because nobody's listening to them. Everyone's watching television. How do we counter program that? This is when the late night DJ shows up. Alan Freed in Cleveland, Ohio, starts playing these rare records in the 1950s of this music that nobody had really heard, but all of the old people really hate it, but the young people think it's great. Now,
Because old people
there
hate
is
it.
there is a fourth element to this. Fourth,
Mhm.
that many finger element to this. So that is the solar cycle number 19.
Okay. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's. Well, I went over Ansgar's head. I know exactly what you're talking about, but you're the guest, so why don't you please explain it to
Sure.
Right,
Ansgar?
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
In solar cycles, you have solar storms. They're putting out all sorts of solar energy, which on the sunny side of the Earth, when it hits, it wipes out radio signals. Absolutely does not work. But at the night side of the Earth, it
Mm,
extends them. It makes them
really?
longer. And solar cycle 19 was one of the biggest we ever had. And it was 11 years, it works in kind of a cycle of 11 years. And that cycle had the most solar storms we had seen in a very long time, not since the big one of the 1850s that melted telegraph wires. Anyway, so on the nighttime side, radio signals traveled farther. And Alan Freed started when he was doing his rock and roll broadcast late at night out of Cleveland, started getting postcards from listeners in Texas
Oh my God.
and from people all over the United States saying, "Hey, we heard this new music. My mom won't let me play it, but I have this new transistor radio, and I hide under my covers at night with my little earphones and I listen to rock and roll." And that hiding under the covers and listening to rock and roll forms that generation because all of a sudden they have something secret and private and nobody knows about it. And the DJs understand this very well and they play into it. The late night DJs would then go to sock hops, they would DJ at dances, and they would become celebrities on their own. Wolfman Jack, Alan Freed,
Yep.
whole group like that. Um, that solar storm cycle pushes radio into bigger and bigger places. Well, once it's starting to spread out, everyone jumps on the bandwagon. And this is a way for radio stations to start recouping money at night when no one's listening to them because they're all watching television. But they've got the teenagers listening to them. So this is kind of that spread of rock and roll was to me not through records. It was through this convoluted mix of all of these guys. And Alan Freed, at the top of his career, had a 1 hour show on Saturday nights on Radio Luxembourg because Radio Luxembourg would broadcast in multiple languages. They would have a German hour, then they would have a French hour, then they would have an English hour. And they played lots of rock and roll, and they became your station of the stars. They had DJs in every language. They played all the rock and roll hits from the different countries, and they started the top 20 countdowns. And
Really?
this is important. That's what's going to really frame the tastes of the generation. Oh, that record's popular? I got to go buy it.
Oh wow.
Well,
Tim had a
I would
question
imagine.
that we've kind of
Sure.
passed up, but I
Oh,
think
I'm sorry.
it's a good question. It says, he asked, weren't coffee houses also the home of stock exchange type businesses and political parties early on?
Oh, absolutely. There's no, you can't separate the political parties, the coffee houses. The stock exchanges is interesting. I have seen political cartoons. Uh,
Mhm.
done at the time of people talking about stock exchanges in coffee houses. So yeah, very very good question. That is part of that attitude.
That's fascinating. But that was
Isn't
the
that
only
fun?
question. But yeah,
Oh, okay. So let me get into this idea of nationalism in radio. I already established that the nations handed out the licenses.
right.
Um, in Weimar Germany, in the 1920s and 30s. They, of course, owned the radio stations. They had some control over the newspapers because they had a democratic socialist government, republic. And so when it came to politics, when it came to elections, rather than, pardon me, the system that we have where the politicians go ahead and buy airtime, if you were running a legitimate candidate running for office, you got free airtime, you got free newspaper space.
I want to
And
point
if you
out
were
real quick. See, here in America, when we think of government broadcasting, that is that is like something that we slander things like Fox News with. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
When we think here in America of government, controlled broadcasting, we only think of despotic dictators. We don't think of necessarily, no, that's just how Europe does it. You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
it is how Europe did it
Yeah.
for many of these places. It did not smack to them as being onerous.
Or
Uh,
authoritative, yeah.
But in the late 1920s, early 1930s, during these German elections during the Weimar Republic, there was a political party that was kind of not accepted as being, they were trying to make it illegitimate because they didn't like what it was saying because it was, really violent and very anti-socialist. Uh, the initials were NSDAP, um, the Nazi Party.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway,
Hey, but I've heard
the
that they had socialist in their name, therefore they were socialist.
Yeah, yeah, because they called themselves
you
socialists.
want
They
to
were
fight?
they were so. Oh,
No, honestly, that's one of the
okay.
most frustrating
Ansgar,
things I
Ansgar,
see on
I love
Twitter
you.
all the time.
I love you, Ansgar, but I'm putting $50 on Dr. Griffin.
Oh my god! Well, if we're going to fight about anything intellectual, she's gonna kick my ass. So nice knowing you.
I don't know about that.
Uh,
Anyway, but the they tried to keep the Nazi Party from going on, from having this opportunity to have free radio and free advertisement.
so they really tried to
Um,
deplatform them.
yes, they tried to deplatform them in the late 1920s, but then they had a change of heart and allowed them to be platformed, and the Nazi Party, Goebbels, was ready to jump on radio. They used radio very very well, very very astutely, and the from that point on, especially when the Nazis take control, they're going to use radio as their medium. Very very important medium. The 1936 Olympics, the Berlin Olympics, the the Nazis were already in charge. It was a one-party government, of course, and they had control of the radio. They set up shortwave radio exchanges throughout the world, and the Berlin Olympics were the first Olympics that were broadcast mainly on shortwave throughout the world.
Wow.
It is at
Nope.
that point. It is at that point when the BBC says, "Hey, shortwave, we like this stuff," and then they start the shortwave phenomenon. BBC shortwave still out there. Um, Shortwave in America uh, becomes ham. It's that what the ham operators use. It becomes an amateur sort of entity. But in Europe, it becomes another avenue to get the word out. And many of the other governments set up shortwave systems so that they can broadcast in different languages. BBC shortwave broadcasts in multiple languages. There was a shortwave system for Czechoslovakia that broadcast in 4 different languages throughout the
Wow.
world. And because of the technology, shortwave can be repeated all over the place. So it has a very different reach than AM or than FM.
Now the Berlin Olympics,
Yep.
if I recall, was basically the first television broadcast. Is that essentially?
They had television cameras. They had a lot of film cameras. I mean, they had Leni Riefenstahl out there.
Yeah. Oh, they
filming
recorded
it.
everything. Yeah.
But television could not be recorded. Television could only be broadcast live,
Mhm.
only at this point, I believe, by wire. So you had to be wired into the system in order to watch it. It was not that they were sending it up. There's, of course, no satellites, and I don't think they had microwave at the time. So for the 28 televisions in Germany, they were busy watching it, and I think it was coming over. It was coming over landlines
but
to do that.
I'm asking because in a historical sense, if I recall, this makes Adolf Hitler, who had done the introduction to that Olympics, essentially one of the first human beings ever broadcast on television, even if it was only to the 20 some odd. He's actually one of the first human beings we broadcast, if I recall, which
I
is
think so too. Yeah.
which is an
Wow.
interesting footnote in history.
Yeah.
Basically, he is one of the first human beings ever broadcast
Right.
on television. He almost groundbreaking, and it turns
Yes.
out to be
But
just
what?
because he happened to do the introduction. It wasn't any
Right.
nobody was propagating his views. The Olympics were in Berlin.
Right.
Yeah.
At the same time, our friend Stalin over in the Soviet Union,
Yep.
Our
they
good
used
buddy.
radio a lot.
Our good, yeah, our friend. Oh God.
Our friend Stalin. Anyway, he Lenin considered radio to be the absolute perfect um, tool of the revolution, if only because he knew most of the Russians were illiterate. And he thought, hey, this is a great way to get the word out. But of course, it's only one-way communication. It's one message to many. And of course, Russia never had a great penetration of um, of telephones. Stalin hated telephones. Stalin thought anyone with a telephone was plotting against him because he couldn't
Really?
control it. But he
Yeah, yeah.
adored radio. The first, which was actually the third international of 1919, 1920. It was the first of the post-Bolshevik Revolution world international communist meeting was done over radio. Of course, there was no one listening because there weren't that many radios out there. But Lenin really loved radio, and Stalin adored it, and it becomes the absolute most important way for Stalin to communicate to other communist party cells throughout Europe. In many places, they were illegal, but he could uh, broadcast, and there was no way to stop that broadcast. So the Soviet Union used radio to put forward their ideas. The Nazi Party used German radio broadcasts beamed into Czechoslovakia to what's the word I'm looking for? Seduce those people in Czechoslovakia who were native German speakers. They lived in Czechoslovakia. They had been subject of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they spoke German. And when the Czechoslovak government took over, started the radio station, they broadcast naturally in Czech.
Right.
And so you had this large number of German speakers who had always considered themselves to be an important part of the population to all of a sudden their radio from their own country ignored them completely. They eventually got 1 hour broadcasting in German, I think, a week. But you had Goebbels in Germany um, broadcasting in German, broadcasting music, broadcasting the Nazi call to unify all German speakers. Basically, the Sudetenland in many ways was constructed by radio.
So this is in essence, especially whereas in World War II, the as it just as it was starting, before it actually started, but it was
Mhm.
the Germans trying to usurp ostensibly at least just a little bit of Czechoslovakia, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and a little bit
Yes,
more.
a little bit of
But
Poland, a little bit of
a
France.
little bit of, we just want a little bit of your country, that's all. But one of the arguments, of course, they were using was this is completely legitimate because these are Germans here, and they're German people, they're German speakers, and so they actually belong with Germany, not with Czechoslovakia. So what we're doing is we are liberating them, which is, by the way, the same argument that the Russians are using when they take the Crimea.
Donbass.
But
yeah,
yeah,
Donbass and the Crimea. Yeah.
yep. But it sounds like they were priming this ahead of time. So before any shots were fired, they are actually trying to win the hearts and minds of a section of Czechoslovakia so that they can legitimize their future actions in trying to usurp and take that section.
It's amazing.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, it's amazing what you can get away with when you call an act of war liberation.
Yes.
You know,
The Anschluss, which was the movement not only to bring in Austria, but also to move west to take back part of the Alsace-Lorraine, or at least the Saar. Part of that was taking Luxembourg. One of the first assets that the Germans take when they start this process is Radio Luxembourg.
that makes
And
sense.
it's through Radio Luxembourg because they say that their argument is that Radio Luxembourg is now broadcasting very damaging information to Germans, and they just wanted to stop that. That damaging information was French language broadcasts advertising French products and English language
Very
broadcasts
dangerous.
advertising English products. And so, they take Radio Luxembourg, and that's the start of course, Lord Haha. Familiar with him?
No.
Once again,
Oh.
Ansgar is not I am, but I will let you explain it
Sure.
to
Lord
Ansgar because
Haha
yes.
was the German equivalent of Tokyo Rose. The Germans found an Englishman with an English accent to start sending pro-Nazi propaganda across the English Channel,
Makes sense.
and he's going to be broadcasting throughout World War II.
Actually, I joke. I didn't remember that. I do kind of remember something about that now, but that's well outside of my. This is why we love having you. Speaking of, and one thing I want to plant a flag before we continue. I think we've discussed platforming before, and your point on essentially what happened as a result of platforming the SS. Is very interesting. So we will have to also have you back to do an entire episode on platforming. How is it handled? What should we do?
Well,
How is it?
certainly it's dangerous to platform someone like that without any sort of counter, without any sort of pushback or framing of how dangerous what they're saying is.
But this was how people like the BBC justified owning the nation, owning the broadcast, was
Right.
that it was dangerous to allow these people to talk, and allow them to put out a very anti-British message,
Right.
or an anti-capitalist message.
Which is
So
interesting
yeah,
because here that's really considered un-American, and people are always confusing what the First Amendment says. The First Amendment does not say you have a right to speak anywhere, anytime, and do whatever. That's what people think it says. It's got
Well,
it absolutely does not say that.
I
But
don't necessarily think people think that. I think that when people in America often talk about freedom of speech, they're talking not necessarily about the First Amendment. They're talking often about the principle of freedom of speech, and then the first argument somebody comes up with is, "Oh well, the First Amendment doesn't protect that speech." Well, that's not what I'm talking about, jackass. I'm talking about the principle.
oh, I agree when you're talking about it, and when people who understand it are talking about it, they do
Yeah.
in general. And I talk about the principle all the time, and every
Yeah.
now and then people go into the First Amendment, and that bugs the living daylights out of me. But I've seen people who have been
Certainly.
deplatformed and have said, well, the First Amendment says I can speak as Miss America on. I mean, when Miss America got deplatformed because she said homophobic things, and then she used the First Amendment
Which
as
is
grounds
stupid.
for why she should give me so. And I think
It
that's a
does show
common
you the
misconception.
caliber of education of your average Miss America contestant, though.
Well,
Just
who was it?
saying.
Was it and this is the only thing I got to be a little more careful with my quotes when Dr. Griffin is or Griffith, sorry, is here, because I always, I'm just like, got to make sure. Was it Churchill who said the best argument against democracy is 10 minutes with the average voter?
I don't, I don't, I do not know that quote. My quote that I know about Churchill and democracy is that Churchill said
Worst form
democracy
of
is the worst sort of
worst form.
government
Yeah.
except for every other kind.
Yeah, he also said that one.
That's good.
So, we got to have a. But in the U.S., we really do. We first of all, I think we do often conflate and think that the First Amendment protects
Certainly.
free speech in all cases.
Right.
But we also do have, as Ansgar pointed out, a notion that that spirit certainly does apply almost universally, and that there's something inherently un-American by saying, we don't like what you're saying, you're going to shut up now, even if technically someone can say that. That's very taboo.
I also
and
think that there's this like narrow, happy medium that needs to be maintained here in America, because like there really is something to be said for just deplatforming anything that we don't like is fucking dangerous, and just
Yes.
platforming without contestation everything is also dangerous. So there's this very narrow, path to be tread, to be quite honest.
Well, America had certain, America, we had a Bund that was pro-German before the war. We had Father Conklin, who was very outspoken in the stuff that he had said. But of course, World War II is going to change the whole mix, in that all of a sudden World War II is a total war, unlike any other war had been. And with total war, when you get your population to commit to give up their sugar, to give up their butter, to give up their rubber bath mats, to stop driving everywhere, to do that, they're going to give up certain ideas about free speech as well. Because it's always going to be couched in terms of public safety,
Right.
in terms of keeping the nation safe. And of course, when you think about the news at this time, you've got all the newspapers, and you've got foreign correspondents that are sending in reports by wire. So you've got almost immediate reports coming through the wire services and going to radio. So radio was where people listened for immediate news. People listen to when you hear people talk about, and I've interviewed people who talk about how they heard about World War II. It was by radio.
Yeah.
So radio was the immediate sort of information they got, oftentimes from foreign correspondents. I'm, thinking of the bombing of Berlin, of Britain, that was carried by Edward R. Murrow with a microphone at the top of the BBC tower. and that's being broadcast, and all the wire services. You
He was
also
on the
had
top of the
news.
BBC tower while Britain was being bombed.
Oh yeah.
That doesn't
I
strike. I mean,
Uh,
obviously, now that I think about it, of course, you'd have to be there because if you got radio, you got to be as high as possible. But that's the biggest target, I would assume. For not that the Germans were necessarily particularly accurate. I mean, there's a misconception that
Well, there's a
Oh yeah.
reason carpet
yeah.
bombing on pretty much every side of the, of the war was the way to go. You wanted to hit one, let's say refinery, you blew up, 6 city blocks trying to hit it.
Yeah. Nick, you're into media. Definitely look up Edward R. Murrow and the Battle of Britain.
I'd also
Um,
like to
I mean,
point out that even though that we have this spirit of in America, we think of freedom of speech as the spirit. I will remind our listeners that at this time, America had some of the most restrictive decency laws on speech in the Western world.
yes.
we still do. We
Yes.
still do. What the FCC allows you to say on television, and what you can broadcast. And by the way, I mean, it's like if you go to the UK and watch the BBC, they will say and do things, and there will be nudity. It's a bit later at night, but they had nudity on the BBC long
They've
before
had
our
nudity in regular old shampoo commercials.
I mean,
Just
which
saying.
is
Well,
another.
that
It's insane that we are
this is
so. Yeah.
the term in European media for that is called third page girls.
Hmm.
It became a trope that you would have your newspaper and you'd have the news on the front, and you'd have the next page would be important news, and then you would have the advertisements on the third page,
Oh.
and you would have nude pictures there. Advertising, that was a third page girl. Anyway,
I wouldn't know
so you
about
would
that. I bought those papers just for the articles.
oh yeah, I know
Of
I know you
course, of
did.
course.
I know you did. But the newspapers were incredibly censored, very, very highly censored. But one of the ways people got their information during World War II was, of course, newsreels. The US and everybody had cameramen everywhere with 16 millimeter cameras shooting footage of everything. The raising of the flag of Iwo Jima, not originally photographed, it was
No.
originally on film.
I did not know
Um,
that.
and those had to be shot, then packaged, then shipped, and processed, and then copied and edited into
And
newsreels.
and isn't
So
there
those,
isn't there a scandal that basically says that the original what we have as filmed is not the actual original raising of the flag, that it was actually a
oh,
Oh, it was
recreation or
that's
something
a
like
restaged.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, that's a long story, but I was just using it as an
Yeah,
example. I didn't
yeah.
want to get into the argument because I don't know enough about it.
Fair
But
enough.
those newsreels are crucial. There were multiple companies putting them out, but they were using a lot of the same footage. But when you start looking back into their release dates and what the newsreels were on the release dates, something that's very fascinating is that uh, December 7th, 1941, they start getting footage of that late in December. And then they start releasing more footage. And every week they would come out with a new newsreel. And every week they would say, new footage from, oh, thank you, new footage from Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Uh, and
Yeah, I
that
find it
would,
fascinating that people actually went to the theater to watch newsreels.
oh yeah. Oh yeah, once a week. Everybody went to the theater once a week, at least. That was
Fascinating.
just something they did.
That'd be like Nick. Imagine you and I meeting up and going to the theater to watch CNN. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just so bizarre to me. Sorry, continue.
No, that's okay. So after World War II, there is this understanding, that Cold War understanding of, number one, we hate authoritarian governments, and number two, we hate communists. And the one thing we knew about communists was that there was only one news source, and that was the government. Pravda, which ironically is truth, and Izvestia, the two main news sources from the Soviet Union.
Truth
Oh
is in
my
the
God.
name, ergo it is true. Like
Yeah.
socialism and Nazis.
So definitely.
I always, when I see a paper called The Truth, I sit there and say, well, that's going to be a reliable paper.
So in order to separate us
Mhm.
from the communists and from the Nazis, we put in all sorts of rules about objective journalism. Now, the newspaper ownership was the same. Radio, there were networks, the Mutual Network, NBC, ABC, CBS. Those were all radio networks before they were television
Now, did this
networks.
actually
Um,
change the journalism or merely create an illusion that we propagated?
that would be an interesting study.
Huh.
I'm not willing to say, oh, absolutely it changed, or it didn't change at
Or maybe
all.
a little from column A and a little from column B.
But we did have the fairness doctrine
Mhm.
that covered both radio and television. That was, of course, taken out by Reagan, and the guys that followed him, the presidents that followed him. So, consequently, there really was a move, I think, to establish at least an air of freedom, free press. Whether it was, here's the thing, whether it was truthful or not, it was at least free.
Right.
Mm.
That you at least were not getting all your news from the government. And
I would argue
that
that
was
at
the
the
main thing.
very least, even having a fair and free objective journalism press as something to look up to and as something to try and live up to has got to be at least in some way positive, even if you don't
It's a
meet it.
wonderful aspirational goal,
Right. Right.
to make that work. Uh, but remember, you only had so many newspapers, and you had very little television.
Hmm.
You had a lot of local radio, but not that much national programming. After about 1960, you you see radio becomes more and more of a regional aspect, except for the wire services, where they're getting their news. Those that sound of you heard in the background when they would play news, that was a teletype machine. That was the wire services, UPI, AP, Reuters, et cetera, et cetera. Those are services that were international, that gained their information and were sent over by teletype to every news station, every radio station, every television station, every airport. It is why when you listen to news on the radio, this is a George Carlin joke, uh, that why do they always give us the temperature from the airport? You ever wonder about that?
Oh.
I think you had mentioned this earlier or in a previous stream you and I were in, but I don't remember.
George Carlin makes a big deal about it's 83 at the airport, but who cares? Because
Yeah.
no one lives out at the airport. That's because the teletype machines, the wire services connected everyone. It was a super important system that had to be protected, from anybody getting in there and playing with them. It was the ultimate gatekeeper. It was Twitter of the elites.
Mm.
Um, did you ever wonder why
The
the
original blue check
newsmen,
marks.
yeah, we're gonna check this. It was how everyone double checked. It was, um, radio stations. If they wanted to report the news, they'd go over to the teletype, and it was called rip and read. They'd rip the paper off the teletype, go um, in front of the microphone, and read off what was on the teletype. They didn't do any reporting. The hotline between Moscow and Washington, D.C., that was installed, of course, with
Shortly
JFK.
after, yeah, shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, it was not a red phone. It was a teletype machine.
Really?
Because teletype machine the printed the what was coming out. It was a keyboard, and that it was kind of like a dot matrix printer, if you're old enough to remember that, and it printed everything out so that you could read it. That's why all the temperature came from the airport, because airports were all connected by this teletype, so that a pilot who was flying from Birmingham to Minnesota could get on the teletype, look down, okay, the current weather in Minnesota is this. And then he'd have that document in hand, and he'd know the temperature and the weather and everything else like that. So the weather systems and the airports and the news systems and political offices all tied together by this teletype system. That was absolutely crucial for running everything.
You're just
And they're
shattering
all
all
gone.
kinds of illusions. My red phone illusion is gone.
Yep.
Uh,
That's
Yep. Yeah, and these teletypes were absolutely crucial, and they were a gatekeeper in that they had to be kept sacrosanct because lives were on the line. Um, Pilots had to be able to trust if someone got on the teletype and was busy typing in all sorts of fake weather reports. Um, you could
yeah,
kill people. It was really super important. And all of them, uh, the news outlets, the wire services, UPI, those were all teletype networks that all of the radio stations and television stations subscribed to. And you could tell the breaking news how important it was by how many bells went off. If it was an important thing that was breaking, a certain number of bells would go off on the teletype machine, and the reporters from who talk about November 22nd, 1963, basically say the one thing they remember from the newsroom was 10 bells. They had never, ever, ever heard a story come
uh,
over the wire with 10 bells, and it was Kennedy's assassination.
right. Wow. That's that's giving me a completely different view of news in that era. I mean, that's incredible.
Well, that was news until current era. That was they started getting rid of the teletype machines in the late 1990s.
That late?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Oh,
Oh
wow.
yeah.
so
Yep.
so now how has it changed in the modern era, and sort of where is media today, which is a very big question. Obviously, we've added the internet, but we're going to be starting to
Right.
hit up on time constraints.
Right.
So
With the demise of this teletype system,
mhm.
with the growth of the internet, all of a sudden, rather than gatekeepers and trusted sources, you get this plethora of information. And now the savvy consumer has to be able to think for themselves. We are back away from the authoritative news that comes down from the nightly news networks, etc., and we are in uncharted territory.
And
Um,
how different is that situation in Europe versus America?
oh, they're the same.
Oh,
They're the
really?
same. With all of a sudden, instead of national news services, you have lots of commercial news services. Sky News, which
Mhm.
is of course Murdoch,
Right.
and a whole bunch of other things. There are a handful of national channels, but because of technology, because they have got a bigger bandwidth to be able to use, and they can use satellites and they can use microwaves, all of a sudden you've got so many more different ways of getting information out, and so much more information, and no gatekeepers. We're in
Well,
the Wild West.
I mean, it would seem that way, but I mean, aren't there a lot of like fairly censorious regulations coming down out of Europe right now on things like the internet?
I think they're coming down in terms of libel and slander laws,
There's
but
not just
and there
that,
are, yeah,
but yeah.
there are certain laws, like in Germany and Austria, you cannot display a swastika. There are
Mhm.
certain symbolic laws like that. Um, but you still have freedom of the press for the
Right.
most part. What you notice now is when you do not have freedom of the press, when you see countries like Hungary, Turkey,
Hmm.
Russia, China trying to contain their press, trying to control what
Well,
message
not
is
just
getting
theirs,
out.
ours. Not just
Yes,
theirs, ours. Yeah. Oh, well, like, okay, I want to point out what I feel like is the difference. Like, I
sure.
forget how many years ago. It was like a year or two ago, something like that. A teenage girl got arrested in the United Kingdom for reposting rap lyrics, literally verbatim posting rap lyrics. Got
Right.
actually arrested.
Mm.
Not just a ticket, actually picked up by the police and arrested. I can't see that happening here in America, and I would think that that would have a very different, like a fundamental difference in how we see communications and electronic communications in particular.
Well, we could easily print out anyone's rap lyrics,
Hmm.
but if you were to copy rap music, it is the it is the property laws
No, no,
that
no,
cover
no. She
those.
didn't try to make money off of it. She
Oh,
posted it on
I
social
know,
media.
I know. But
Oh,
look
okay.
at Napster.
Mm,
Look at this intellectual theft
right.
of stealing music,
Certainly.
when they could have been paid 99 cents per song. And remember, if when that came down the pike,
Hmm.
uh, a decade or so, well, it was longer than that, almost
Yeah, I
two
don't
decades.
remember.
Uh,
Let's just
you
say
know,
I
when
have
people,
thousands of songs on my hard drive. Don't ask me where I got them.
yes,
They just
exactly.
they just
But
they apparated on his hard drive, and
right, but
I
those,
really, well, just let me just say officially, In Time does not condone or support the theft of any intellectual property. That includes but is not limited to music, movies, or anything like that. Ansgar, after the show, you need to tell me what your source is for that so that I can check out and make sure that it's all legit. Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
that's why. So if you have any torrent sources or anything like that, let me know off the record.
Of
Anyways,
course, of
please
course.
continue. Of course.
and you're just measuring the bandwidth. That's all.
I measured
Um,
exactly. Misha gets it.
She
Why did I have?
understands.
She gets it. I need to do bandwidth testing. I'm a journalist, and I'm going to report on the like Pirate Bay and Zoki. Not that I mean I don't know how I heard of that. Again, that's just one of those little facts that's in there. But we don't condone any of it. Please continue.
but it's the property laws that are constraining, not anything to do with morality or politics.
Okay.
Um, it is those with the deepest pockets are hiring lawyers and going after those that are using the system or abusing the system. Um,
Right.
although someone said, how you really think you can overrun the libidos of horny 14 of every horny 14-year-old in the United States? They're going to get pornography.
Of course.
Um, but the idea of this escalation of we're going to find a way to do this, and someone's going to find a way to make money off of this, and someone's going to find a way to sue these people to keep them from making money off of this. And now, rather than libel and slander laws, we have algorithms.
Yeah.
Mm,
Those are our new limiting factors, is the algorithms involved in if you're saying the wrong word on YouTube, oh, you get demonetized.
I
And it's
think.
all based on algorithms, not on anything
Well, I think one of the things
important.
that worries me is with our communications and media so global, right?
Hmm.
Companies are incentivized to choose the market that has the most restrictive um you know what I mean, laws and just conformed them for everyone. You know what I
Right.
mean? And that really worries me because we're already seeing impacts of that.
Well, libel and slander laws vary from all over the place, and Great Britain has extremely strict libel and slander laws, which is why there was a case a few years ago of a Saudi Arabian businessman didn't like what wanted to make sure he could sue somebody for saying something about him. So he paid to have this whatever it was piece of video aired in England, and then he could sue that person for saying awful
Oh
things
my
about him.
God.
I mean, it was really a convoluted case,
Wow.
but it highlighted the laws in Great Britain. So they are um, they're very interesting because we don't have any universal standards. Oh, we have a question from
Uh,
Theo Reticoli. Please ask Doctor about Edward B. May's techniques of propaganda. Ooh.
We're getting a little short on time. I want to
Yeah.
get to that. I
Yeah.
want to get to how it influences modern elections and so on and so forth. But I think Ansgar brought up a really good point, so I'd like to reframe it just to make sure that it gets hit on, because I think it's an excellent point. I think his point was more to say markets like China. So China has very restrictive, as we pointed out, they control what can come in through the internet. And so there are companies that say, well, we want to make sure that we can broadcast in China. So since they are the highest bar that we have to clear, we clear that bar for everybody, and all our broadcasting meets the restrictive standards of China. So even when they're broadcasting in the US, it's censored to the Chinese level so that they don't have to have, I
Right.
think that was Ansgar's point. I
Yeah,
think that's
precisely.
worth quickly hitting.
Yeah, just as elementary school textbooks, it used to be California bought the most elementary school textbooks, so every textbook author wrote their textbooks to California standards.
Hmm.
Yes.
Makes sense.
So I think that's what you're saying,
Yeah,
Ansgar,
basically.
isn't it? Yeah.
And we're seeing that particularly global people that want to have a movie, let's say, have global appeal, will make sure that it is censored to Chinese standards because it's
Mhm.
far cheaper than making two versions of your movie. It's
Right.
or two versions of your broadcast or two versions of whatever you want.
Hmm.
I will say this, and this is interesting. There was a children's movie, Zootopia. And what they did for that was they made about 10 or 15 versions of it, and they're identical about 98%. But in there's a broadcaster seen it. Now this is easier because it's animation, so they can put characters in and out really
Sure.
easily. What they did was, for example, in China, they would replace certain characters that with a panda, which is an important Chinese cultural figure. In Russia, that same character would be a bear and then they would change the characters and they would make some modifications to, but I think that's that's the exception that proves the rule, and that was only just tiny changes.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting, and it's really cool that they did that. And it's kind of strange that you could see the same movie and there could be different characters of different kinds of animals based on what country you're seeing it in, but very few actually do that. I think that's sort of an interesting aside. It's the exception that proves the rule.
It really is.
Most people aren't gonna, most producers. Yeah, I think that's a interesting. What was the question that we had in the live chat, or the
Oh, Theo Reticoli wanted to know about Edward B. Mays and his techniques of propaganda, and I think that's a whole show in and of itself. Propaganda is so much fun to talk about, and it's not quite
Yes, it is.
what we're
I
going
would
into.
love to get into a show about propaganda because some of my favorite comics are propaganda comics, big time propaganda comics.
Yeah.
Well, Ansgar, you don't know this, but so we had actually you do, because you had signed off on the changes. We had changed so we have, in order for guests to come on the show, they have to sign a waiver on copyright infringement laws and free speech, so that we don't get hit in case somebody tries to hit us with a copyright DCMA thing. But we've included into that, if you say that there is a good show idea on our air, you are committed to coming back and actually doing that show. So Dr. Misha Griffin has actually contractually agreed now to do one on platforming and one on propaganda. So you can expect her back.
Ow!
She will be back twice, at least twice in the next couple of months. She has contractually agreed to it. There's nothing she can do. We have a hard time booking guests. We kind of have to do this sneaky stuff where it's like you sign. We have the iTunes kind of agreement. It's 16 pages, but in there it's, Nick is always right. Dave is at fault for everything. And if you say a good show idea, you're committed to doing it. So there's all sorts of things that she's already agreed to. But this is marvelous. So we'll have you back for propaganda too.
Cool. I'm not ready yet, but
our audience, I'm
sounds fun.
sure, would object, but we'll
But we
find
should
a way
we should
to.
definitely, before we run out of time, get into how media and elections are intricately linked.
Yes. So where are we today with all of this?
Well, in America, it's a money-making proposition. There are, by law, television stations and radio stations have to sell time to candidates at a particular level, which is a formula that's held under the law. So they can't jack up prices on one candidate they don't like and give away prices. So everyone pays the same amount of money for these advertisements. So that's one constricting factor, but none of that applies to social media. Social media is simply out there.
It's completely unregulated
Ripe
for the most part.
picking. Yeah.
It is the Wild West.
Yeah, and of course with Citizens United, money is speech, that we have the PACs, we have the super PACs. I remember watching Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report going into great detail about super PACs and how crazy they were and his little stunts.
Yeah, and he did that he actually had a former lawyer from the Federal Election Commission who was his personal lawyer come on, and they would actually create a super PAC right then and there to bribe. And there was sort of no bones about it. It was just a little one-page form. Oh God, yes, that was a good show.
So the intersection between lobbying and Congress and political elections and PACs and now social media, where there is no gatekeepers, no fact checking.
And most
it's
people
all up
just
to us.
retweet headlines without ever even looking at an article or considering its sources. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, this is something else I wanted to talk about on a future show, and that's the Gerasimov doctrine, which was an idea of the Soviet. God, showing my age. Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Russia has got this actual military plan of disrupting everything,
Mm-hmm.
And how to do it over the internet, whatever. So it's interesting when you start putting that in the mix. Are there actual entities out there who are there to disrupt? And I think what fascinates me most about what's going on in this age of information, we don't have to convince one side to switch over to the other side.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what's going on anywhere in this political landscape. We are in what I call the age of doubt. All you need to do is to make sure people doubt.
Right.
That says, when the flat earthers make all these endless videos that they don't talk about the flat earth model, they tear down the globe model.
Right.
And they don't have to tear it down well, they just have to get you to start doubting it.
That's an interesting
and
point.
it keeps going on.
That's a really good. I've been doing the flat Earth stuff actually for a while, and I never even really thought about. I mean, I've talked about switching the narrative so that they have to prove their model instead of disprove. But that's a good point.
I
All
want to.
all they have to do is doubt, and this is um, the when you look at Russian media now, Sputnik and RT, they're not trying to say you all have to be Russians. They're not trying to say, yay, our side. All they're doing is getting you to doubt what your side is saying to you. And
I
I
would
think,
like to, as a resident of California, I see this firsthand a lot. Like just as an example, some months ago, what's his name from Loveline? I forget
Drew,
the
Dr. Drew, or
Dr. Drew
what's the other one?
Pinsky,
Yeah.
suggested, right, complete assertion, presents no evidence, nothing, just suggests that in his opinion, there are rats in LA that are carrying bubonic plague. Now,
There are rats with plague in
no,
LA.
nope,
no.
nope.
Well, wait, Dr.
Chipmunks,
Drew said it. He's wait.
Exactly.
He's a
So no,
doctor. He said it.
that was the headlines and the narrative on social media. In fact, right now, pretty much all of even centrist to right-wing Twitter will tell you that LA is infested with bubonic plague via rats.
God.
There's poop all over the streets in San Francisco. And that you have to have an app to navigate all of the poop on the streets.
Holy!
This is what they are actually saying. This is what people actually believe about
wait. Okay. Anybody in the live chat who's a programmer, we're going to make an app for this, and we're going to get rich. We're going to put a poop navigating app from In Time to navigate your bubonic poop in California. Just contact me.
Okay.
We'll get that worked out.
And let's not forget that, according to them, straws are banned in California. Now,
yes.
What happened is 3 counties in California experimented with taking plastic straws out of only fast food restaurants, and switching to paper straws in fast food restaurants. But if you believe Twitter, California has banned plastic straws, even though the only place that has actually done that in America so far isn't in California at all.
Oh, and by the way, Ansgar,
Huh.
look up bubonic plague and cases in America. Last I checked,
in the Midwest.
Yersinia pestis,
About
the
6
microbe
a year,
that
if I recall.
lives on the fleas, those fleas live on chipmunks, wild chipmunks. We get about a half a dozen cases of bubonic plague a year.
Oh yeah,
we're able to cure it. It does happen, but it's not on rats; it's on chipmunks.
Yeah, it's not in cities. It's mostly
It's
people
out.
who live on ranches and
Right.
farmlands, and people who go camping, and they spray for it every year. Actually, in places like campgrounds, to kill the fleas. No, really, they go to campgrounds here in California and spray for fleas and things like that, just to make sure that just to be extra cautious for campers. Interestingly
Don't play
enough.
with the chipmunks.
Do not play with the chipmunks.
Just to clarify, Dr. Misha Griffin, and she is a doctor, is telling all of you to murder chipmunks. It is play
with their corpses.
It is a public
I said, don't
safety.
Play.
It is a public safety.
And
yes,
remember,
that is correct.
We don't
play. We murder them.
And snuggle their corpses once they're dead. Make sure you sleep with their corpses. And yes, that is what you do.
Okay, that is not doctor endorsed, but the murder is when she says, well, when you see a chipmunk, she said,
chipmunks jump into it like a swimming pool and swim through the corpses of chipmunks, you'll be fine. It's the only way to protect you from the plague.
This is code. This is code. She was saying earlier. When you see a chipmunk, you don't play. You don't play. We kill it. All right. So now that we've established that, I'm not sure whether or not we're ever going to get her back for another show, but it depends on how drunk we can get her before we start broadcasting. So,
No, I'm desperate enough for a social activity. I'll come back.
well, it's not grading papers, so all right. So we're talking about because I think this is I really want to make sure we hit this before we go. So you were talking about social
Misinformation,
media
basically, and social media and elections.
and sowing doubt, and so because I do think that had a huge impact. There was a lot of, I mean, there was Hillary emails, fake news, things just went crazy over and there was talk too of subliminal Trump programming, where people would actually try to insert Trump names and other kinds of subliminal Trump messages into Trump media, and that this somehow Trump influenced the Trump election in ways that now I never saw any Trump examples of this, but if any people knew where this Trump was happening, I would love to know about it. Any comments on the subliminal, like, or other kinds of influencing media?
Just so you know, Misha,
keep
we
a
are
straight
working
face.
on ways of muting Nick from here. I'm sorry we haven't figured that out just yet, but it is in the works.
It's a top priority on this show. The producers, everybody's agreed that there is a significant fault on in time, and it seems to be on the left side of the of the programming window. But anyways,
and Ansgar, perhaps we can wire up his chair.
Ooh.
Oh no!
She's a
Nobody
genius.
goes near the chair. Nobody goes near the yeah. Ansgar's gonna have the button. I'm gonna be sitting there going like, guys, I wanted to talk about socialism and
This can be done.
This can be done. I am rethinking having Misha back. Anyways, so
never buy office furniture from a company called Milgram.
Milgram.
Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! Especially not if Ansgar's the teacher. He's gonna be like, well, let's just go straight to the XXX button on the thing. Let's just go straight to the last one. I'll forget all the hit and the butt switches in between. I'm going to the last switch.
Oh, who's on the other side, Nick?
What happened?
You haven't even asked him a question yet.
Can you just keep the button locked down? I mean, this is awfully inconvenient. All right, so
social media,
influencing the election,
elections, disinformation.
We're screwed.
We're screwed. All right. Well, that's I
abandon
I'm feeling
hope.
so much better about our next. Abandon all hope. You are, yeah. So what happened? Is there any defense right now? I mean, I do think there was a lot of sowing doubt, and even Trump had talked about, if the election didn't come back the way he wanted, he might attack the integrity of it. Doubt. How do we? We don't know what Hillary may or may not have done. There were emails that are missing. Who knows? So, what happened there, and what are we looking at, do you think, in the next election?
I don't know. I don't have a real positive.
Well, then why the hell are you here? For a guest that we bring on,
chair.
Why don't
this
I
don't know comes out of your mouth. So
we're no. I tell my students the most important button you find on any website is the About button. About us. Look at the source. Try to figure out where the source comes from. Don't automatically accept anything and don't automatically discard anything before you've done due diligence. But I honestly do not know of real news sources that I'll say, yeah, no problem. Just like Walter Cronkite, I trusted 100%. I can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
I
Even
simply
AP and
cannot.
Reuters would be off the table for you?
Reuters?
Yeah.
Do you know where they started? They were a carrier pigeon company. I was researching this earlier so I could talk more intelligently about wire services.
Yeah.
Mr. Reuters owned a bunch of carrier pigeons, and he noticed that there was a gap in the telegraph wires between 2 points in Germany, and so he offered his services of his carrier pigeons to send information from these 2 points that had this gap. And that is literally how Reuters started as a wire
And what, you got
service.
something against pigeons that just automatically?
I love pigeons. Pigeons,
Okay.
pigeons, pigeons are wonderful. I have a whole story about pigeons in World War II.
So, but I've always thought of Reuters as a reasonably reliable news source, certainly AP. Now, it's you haven't said anything about AP, but so
okay.
Reuters, because Reuters used pigeons, they're not reliable.
All right. Reuters is a public company. AP
Yes.
is a nonprofit cooperative.
Mm.
Agence France Presse is state-owned enterprise. Canadian Press, non-for-profit. Deutsches Presseagentur is public company with the limit that no shareholder may own more than 1.5% of the shares. What I'm basically getting out, United Press International, no information. What I'm basically getting at is who's inputting this and who's paying for it. Nonprofit cooperative, maybe yes, maybe no. Private corporation, state-run corporation. What are you willing to tolerate?
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to ask yourself that. I don't look at any news article without checking multiple sources. I like, as you suggest, going to Reuters, going to AP, going to UPI, and checking that against various sources. But I also look at the Guardian, and I also look at the Times of London. I look at New York Times, and I would look at the Washington Post, but they're behind a paywall.
Yeah.
So, but there are certain places that I look at. I say I'm not touching it. Epoch Times, no.
I don't know about you
keep
guys, but I
sitting.
get all my news from the Onion.
Yeah, so does Trump. How often has he retweeted something from the Onion that he thought was real?
Okay. The latest article I saw from the Onion was college freshmen upset that they're having to share a dorm room with an adjunct professor. Don't buy it. None of the adjunct professors I know can afford paying for a dorm room.
I love the
Living
Onion,
in our
man. They're just
cars, yes.
fantastic.
Paying for a dorm room, no.
So, oh shoot, I had a question and I've spaced it. We were talking about okay.
That.
Oh well, no. One of the things that I don't apologize. It's been spectacular. So one of the things, and I'll say this. When I get into debates with people, Fox News is usually one of my go-to sources, and the reason is because while I do find it highly biased, it does often quote AP articles, and you can actually reference pretty decent materials off of Fox News. But I find, while I am leaning very far to the left, I find MSNBC to be almost as bad. I don't think it's quite as bad, but MSNBC isn't, just because it's liberal doesn't mean that they're not really pushing their foot on the gas of how do we gaslight people? How do we get people really interested in what we're saying? And how do we paint the right as evil and in a way to mobilize our own? So it seems to me that a lot of the more popular news networks are more about mobilizing the masses towards a particular agenda than education news. Or so one is that, do you think that's an accurate view? And two, if that is, how do we, if we do go to sort of what was originally the Walter Cronkite that you had been talking about earlier, and where there are news organizations that are either, I mean, it sounds like if you don't hold yourself accountable, nobody else is, but how do we get back to that if we do?
The
I stumped her. A
I
hard question. I
yeah,
This is
stumped her.
telling.
I've been trying to
Yes,
figure out how to.
it's we got Dr. Griffith here.
Oh,
Griffith here.
she
And she's like,
goes,
I
"Hey
don't. Yeah, this
guys,
is gonna be.
we're fucked."
Look,
Yeah.
I'm getting accused of being chipmunk Hitler in the live chat. Okay.
Well, I was gonna try to add pigeons. You very nearly had me adding genocide against pigeons too, because you seem to have something against them. But I'll let that go.
Chipmunk Hitler.
Chipmunk Hitler. Wow.
Oh, now she's going her Twitter bio.
Well, this is. I do have a feeling. We gotta. I do want to remind Dr. Griffith of our also our policy on slandering us when you leave the show and going around telling people, oh yeah, I went on in time. They're a bunch of professionals. They sat there and said I was interested in genocide against chipmunks and pigeons. That's you're not permitted to just to reiterate. And since we've been discussing privacy and copyright laws and all that other good
Okay,
stuff,
maybe we should just give up on the truth.
yeah, yeah.
I think
Uh,
okay, but here's the problem. We need this information to make decisions. And
Yeah.
if we can't trust the information, how are we going to make these decisions? We're in big trouble.
I see a
And
lot of parallels to a very screwed up time in history, to be quite honest. And I've made the comparison before. I know you and I kind of talked about it before, but the last time, the people who it benefited were allowed to basically own and run media without any sort of opposition. They bought and installed their own damn president. Just saying. I mean, if I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to go full conspiratorial, but if the big tech companies had already decided to install a president, there would be no way of us even knowing at this point.
I
Yeah.
I do not see any policies coming out that are benefiting anybody but the 1%.
Yeah. I mean, they just tore
Well,
down net neutrality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it becomes difficult because without some form of regulation, I'm not sure how you can hold people to a standard. But the second you have regulation, whoever then controls those regulations become the same gatekeepers that you're trying to avoid having in the first place.
Right.
So it's a bit of a chicken in the hen Mobius loop of a problem.
And having gatekeepers was no guarantee of having great media, because an editor always chooses what articles to run with and what articles not to run with, and so there still is
Right.
that choice there that comes down to a very subjective sort of choice, as in what sells newspapers, what keeps eyes on the television set, what keeps people tuning in to the radio
Well,
at this time.
the thing is, at least with newspapers, especially once you broke up these oligarchs owning so many newspapers, was at least there was a diverse set of opinions you could potentially read. The problem with the tech giants is there's literally three big ones: Facebook,
Mhm.
Twitter, YouTube, and every other competition is so dwarfed they may as well be monopolies on. And you really have, if you get most of your information from Twitter, you have one company
Mhm.
that can decide what you're allowed to hear and how you're allowed to hear it and from who. If you get your news from YouTube, once again, same thing, Google. If you get your news from Facebook, once Zuckerberg gets to decide what you're allowed to hear, who you're allowed to hear it from, and that's that. If there was more competition in the market, it would be less terrifying.
I don't. I'm all for competition, but I see the information coming at us like water out of a fire hose to
Yeah.
begin with. If we had only select little bits of information, it wouldn't be, and we could carefully digest this information, it wouldn't be that bad. But I feel like it's coming at me like a fire hose. I don't have time to sit down and digest everything and to
Certainly
think
don't
about
even
it.
have enough time to put out all the fires of misinformation. Just what comes
Oh,
across
Jesus,
my
yeah.
feed. If I
Oh,
if
yeah.
I engaged every single bit of misinformation that I see come across my feed on, let's say, Twitter, that would be all I did all day.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you can't win any of those engagements because they can just fire with more misinformation. I mean, it's almost like the ultimate troll, uh, you know,
Yeah.
loop.
And
It's any yeah.
this is part of the age of doubt.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Is
what
that
I see
you
is
have
media
yes.
companies engaging in this too. Like they've learned. Just as an example, right? Any movie that this is just on the commercial section. Any movie that receives large pushback and criticism, the what you see in the news is not people didn't like this movie. It's no. Trolls on the internet attacked this movie. No, people just didn't like your movie. Shut up.
It's just a bad movie. Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, the trolls were all over the Last Jedi movie. I
Oh
mean,
yeah,
that was obviously it was a masterpiece, and
And anyone who
probably the
didn't like it
best.
was just a sexist son of a bitch. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh,
Especially women who
well,
didn't like it. They were
oh
definitely
God.
sexist.
We have to. This is going to become the Dr.
Hey,
Misha program. We're going to have to
I
say.
haven't seen it yet. Don't spoil it for me.
I'm not talking the Rise of Skywalker that's out now. I haven't seen. I don't even think it's out yet. But
No,
no,
okay.
this is going to end up becoming the Dr. Misha Griffith hour within time because I just came up with another one that I would love to have you on for, which was oh shoot, wait a minute, now I just lost my train of thought. We were talking about spinning the
Media
narrative.
spins, narratives, misinformation on Twitter. How easy
I'm
it
gonna
is
have
to
to.
just, yeah.
Yeah, well, after that, no, I had another one that I thought would be really good,
Fake
but I think I
news.
just spaced it.
Okay, well we have an important question from Tony Designs in the chat.
Okay.
And Tony, I'd like to sincerely address you. I have worked in pizza parlors. I'm not proud of it. I put pineapple on pizza. Not my pizza. Other people's
Geez.
pizza. And I'm really ashamed to say, they paid me for it.
So you are now
What
Pizza
could I
Hitler too.
do? I was young. I was just following orders, Tony.
But you know now you were wrong, right? I mean,
I know. No. Yeah, I was wrong. I don't work in pizza parlors anymore, and I wouldn't put pineapple on pizza
There's
per
no
se.
excuse for being a pizza
But
Nazi.
oh,
no,
she's so
I was
brave. She's
young,
so brave. She's
Ansgar. I
coming
was
out here and
young.
admitting
Come
this.
on, please
Ansgar, how can
forgive
you?
me. It was a high school job. We were
Ansgar, how can you
starving.
not
There's 12 of us in a
sympathize?
room.
I understand. I really
Anyway,
do. I understand,
you
and you're so
thank
you
you,
brave.
Nick.
were a
Thank you, Nick.
a pineapple collaborator. Got it.
Okay. So we're gonna have to we're gonna put on the In Time website. We are gonna do profiles of all of our guests, and hers is gonna start with chipmunk genocide and pineapple collaborator. And I think that's gonna. And I have actually since remembered because this spurred what I would like to have you back on again for. So we're just gonna have to have the Dr. Misha Griffin show.
It's going to cost you, Nick.
God, doesn't it always? What I was thinking was, in particular, the use of language to shut down discussions. So, calling people a Nazi, calling people homophobic or transphobic, calling people sexist, and using that language to control perception, to control who gets to talk by the use of the language, not the use of an
Especially
argument,
labels.
not the use of, yes, and to navigate that, to control perception, control, even going maybe even as deep as 1984, where you talk about how by using certain language, you can control the narrative before the discussion even begins. So I think that would be another interesting one to
I think
have.
that's important. I think it's important to reveal that that the process, the cancel society, cancel culture process, etc. It's critical to understand that people that participate in that process are poo-poo heads, and that that we shouldn't be listening to them.
Yeah.
Shut them down.
Well, here's my thoughts on Nazis before I know we got to start
Sorry.
wrapping up. Is no one alive, except for maybe a few living World War II vets, have seen a Nazi. Nobody on Twitter is fighting Nazis. The people that even the
What?
people
No,
who
I'm
call
fighting lots of Nazis on Twitter. Don't take that away from me.
even the people who wear a Nazi armband and call themselves Nazis are not Nazis. And by labeling them a Nazi, you actually are kind of legitimizing them, and you are swelling their chests with pride, because only two things can happen when you call someone a Nazi. Either you're paying them a compliment they haven't earned, or you are labeling them with something that is so far from what they really are that you're just a liar. There is absolutely no benefit in labeling somebody a Nazi in the modern day. Call them neo-Nazis, call them racist shitbags,
Call
because
them
they might be, but yeah.
wannabes.
Yes, they're
Wannabes.
cosplayers at best.
Oh, they're
Cosplayers.
LARPing.
Yes,
Nazi LARPing.
exactly.
I was going to make a couple of jokes because that segued into a couple, but that's not. I think you got a really good point. You had said that earlier too, where it's just if some of them will take that as a compliment, and the ones that wouldn't aren't Nazis anyway. So it's not.
Exactly.
You made that point. I mean, I think that's a really good point. I really hate it when you make points I can't joke about because they're too good. So, all right, I do think we need to be wrapping this up. Dr. Griffith, is there anything else that you wanted to sort of hit on that we hadn't gotten to in the discussion?
I'd also like to point she's driven a nearly 2.5-hour show, our only nearly 2.5-hour show, and it has felt like a half-hour show.
No,
So
it's been 2
It's
hours.
been a lot of fun.
Anyway. Oh well. Oh, my
So
pipe's
was
full.
there anything you wanted to?
No. I can't think of. I have just. The attic's been cleaned out. There's nothing left. But I think this is worthy. I've got a whole list of things that I have written down that we want to talk about in the future. I don't think we're going to solve the problem we were talking about, whatever we were talking about, chipmunks on pizza, pineapple. I don't remember. Pineapple Hitlers. Anyway, no. Understanding the technology behind media, that's where I was going. Understanding the technology behind media helps you kind of understand the media. It makes it a little bit more transparent. It doesn't it doesn't make it feel like, oh, well, they're doing this thing because they're megalomaniacs or whatever. There's not a lot of Lex Luthors out there, just not. But there are lots of technological limitations that are going to make things change. Although I'm not a technological determinist, I think human behavior guides technology more. But right now we are at a dangerous crossroads, and putting way too much faith into the system that has been built up as if it's the end all and be all, and it's going to get us to the truth, and it's not. That's up to each and every one of us. to decide. I think we need to take responsibility for our own understandings, but do so with the help of people who are approaching this with honest goals and willing to enter that public sphere, not poke a hole in it, not malform it, but honestly allow it to be a public sphere where all of the ideas can come in and can be debated.
That's beautiful. Well said.
All right. Well, that's I think we certainly share those goals, and that's one of the reasons we love having you on. So,
Yeah.
thank you very much for accommodating us and sort of meeting our schedule. We sincerely appreciate it. Thank you for coming on. We will absolutely have you back on again, probably several times. I think in the near future. We've
I
come up
will
with a lot
enjoy
of
that.
topics. But thank you very much, and thank you to everyone in the live chat and everybody who contributed. We sincerely appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you all very much.
See you later.